Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? She appeared in the park, but the playground was gone. It was a quiet afternoon when I first noticed her. The park had always been my place of solitude, a small, tucked-away corner of the city where I could escape for a few hours. I had been visiting the park for years, sitting on the same bench by the old oak tree, reading, or sometimes just watching the world drift by. The playground had been there as long as I could remember: rusted swings, faded slides, and an old merry-go-round that creaked when it turned. It was nothing special, really, just a typical park with a playground that children would gather around on weekends, but it had a kind of charm to it. It felt familiar. I had been sitting on my usual bench when I first saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse, someone moving at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, she was there. She was standing by the entrance of the park, just at the edge of the path where the trees opened up to the green. She wasn't like the others who usually passed by, the joggers or dogs. There was something different about her, something that caught my eye. She wore a long, dark coat, and her hair was pinned up neatly, though a few stray strands were blowing in the gentle breeze. Her face was pale, almost too pale, but what struck me the most were her eyes, wide and searching, like she was looking for something, or someone. For a moment, I thought she was lost. She looked out of place, like she had stepped out of time. And maybe she had. There was something about her that didn't quite belong. I stood up to offer help, or at least to ask if she needed directions, but as I took a step toward her, she turned and began walking deeper into the park, her pace measured but purposeful. She didn't glance back at me. There was no hesitation in her movement, as if she knew exactly where she was going. The soft sound of her footsteps on the gravel path seemed to echo louder than it should have. I watched her for a moment, my curiosity piqued. Without thinking, I began walking after her, not fast, just enough to keep her in sight. It was strange to feel this drawn to someone I didn't know, especially in a place that I had always considered my own. But something about her intrigued me, and I found myself moving through the park, following her. She led me past the old playground, where I paused for a moment to take in the familiar sight. But then, something caught my breath. The playground, it was gone. In its place, there was nothing but empty grass, a patch of dirt where the swings used to hang, and the faintest outline of where the slide once stood. The merry-go-round had vanished completely, and the sand pit, which I remember being filled with worn, colorful toys, was now just an empty hole in the ground. The park was quiet, unnervingly so, and there was no sound of children playing, no laughter, no squeals. It was as though the playground had never existed. I stood there, staring at the empty space, my mind struggling to make sense of it. I had been coming to this park for years. I knew every inch of it, every detail. The playground had always been there, a constant part of the park's charm. So why wasn't it there now? As I turned back toward the woman, I saw that she was standing at the far end of the park, near the old, weathered fountain. She had stopped walking and was now staring at the empty spot where the playground used to be. Her gaze was focused, intent, as though she, too, had noticed the change. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy. I took a step closer to her, my heart suddenly pounding. "Excuse me," I called, my voice unsteady. "Did you see the playground? Where did it go?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine. There was something unsettling in her gaze, like she had known this was going to happen, like she was waiting for me to notice. Her expression softened, but there was still a strange distance between us. "It's not gone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's just hidden." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Hidden? What do you mean?" I asked, the confusion clear in my voice. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she motioned toward the fountain behind her. "Come," she said, her tone gentler now. "It's just over here." I hesitated. There was a part of me that wanted to run, to walk away, and forget this moment ever happened. But another part of me, something deep inside, something I didn't understand, urged me to follow her. I took a deep breath and stepped toward her, each footfall heavier than the last. She led me to the fountain, an old, ornate structure that had been here longer than I could remember. It was cracked and weathered, but the water still trickled from the spout in the middle, pooling in the basin below. The faint sound of running water filled the air, breaking the stillness. She stood by the fountain, waiting for me to join her. "Look closely," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the base of the fountain. I did, not knowing exactly what I was supposed to see. The fountain had always been here, in the same place, in the same shape. But now, as I looked at it, I noticed something strange. There was a shimmer in the air around it, a subtle distortion that made my eyes strain to focus. As I looked harder, I could almost see the outline of something. Behind the fountain, I stepped closer, my breath quickening as the air seemed to grow colder around me. The shimmer grew stronger, the distortion warping like a reflection in a rippling pond. And then, just as I thought I might be seeing things, the shimmer vanished. And there, in front of me, appeared the playground. It was just as it had always been, swaying gently in the breeze. The slide gleaming in the dim light, the merry-going turning slowly. It was exactly as I remembered it, as if time had folded back on itself and allowed the playground to return. But when I reached out to touch it, the ground beneath my feet felt different, like I was walking through a dream. I looked at the woman, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her gaze was fixed ahead, at the playground, her face unreadable. I turned back to the scene before me. The playground felt real, but something was wrong. It was too still. There were no children playing, no laughter in the air. The air itself felt thick, like I had stepped into some alternate version of this place, where the past was alive but everything else had faded away. "Why did you bring me here?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. She didn't reply at first. When she did, her words were quiet, almost lost in the wind. "Because this place remembers, but only if you're willing to see it." I turned to her, but she was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. I wanted to call out to her, to ask her more, but something stopped me. I was alone again, standing in the park, with the playground before me. It was real, and it wasn't. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, seemed so far away now, as if I had crossed into another world entirely. I took one last look at the swings, the empty space where the children should have been, but there was no sound, no movement. Only the quiet stillness of a place that shouldn't have been there. And yet, it was. I heard voices behind closed doors, but all were empty. It was an old building, the kind you pass by every day without ever really seeing it, its walls cracked from years of weather, the windows fogged with dust, the air thick with the weight of time. I had never been inside before, but for some reason, that day, I found myself at its threshold. I had been walking down the street, my mind lost in the typical fog of a long, monotonous day. The city was quiet, still, as if holding its breath before the rush of evening commuters returned. But as I walked, I noticed something, a sound, soft and muffled, like whispers coming from behind the closed door of the building. It wasn't anything extraordinary. Buildings in the city are full of sounds, after all. The faint hum of a machine, the rustle of papers, the murmur of conversations leaking through cracks. But this was different. These voices weren't the kind of sounds that would naturally drift from an old, abandoned building. They were too clear, too deliberate. I stopped in front of the door, a feeling of unease creeping over me as I listened. The voices seemed to speak in a language I didn't recognize, soft and almost melodic, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I glanced around, expecting to see someone else on the street, but the road was empty. The air had grown heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn in. Curiosity pushed me forward. I don't know why, but my hand reached for the doorknob. The building looked abandoned, but the door was solid, unmoving, the brass knob cold beneath my fingers. The whispers continued, now more pronounced, more insistent. It was as if they were inviting me inside, urging me to come closer. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the air inside thick with the smell of damp wood and dust. The interior was dark, lit only by the faintest sliver of light coming from somewhere far beyond the entryway. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness as I stepped in, my shoes creaking on the old floorboards. And then, just as I crossed the threshold, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening. It wasn't the normal silence you'd expect in an abandoned building, the kind that feels like a natural void. No, this silence felt wrong. It was deep, suffocating, like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. I hesitated, looking around the dim hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, echoing louder than they should have. The building felt bigger than it had looked from the outside, the hallway stretching forward, disappearing into the gloom. I wasn't sure why I continued walking. Perhaps it was the hope of finding something, anything that could explain the strange pull I felt. Or perhaps it was that deep-rooted human instinct to seek answers, even when every warning sign in my body screamed for me to leave. The hallway narrowed as I walked deeper inside, the faintest sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. The doors on either side were closed, their edges chipped and weathered, but each one seemed to hum with a subtle energy, as if there was something inside, something waiting. The whispers had returned too, faint and distant, like the voices were hidden behind these closed doors, just out of reach. I reached for the first door, my hand trembling slightly. The whispers grew louder as I touched the handle. I could hear them clearer now, the voices overlapping each other, some speaking faster, some slower. but all with that same eerie quality. They seemed welcoming, somehow, like they knew me. I pulled the door open. Empty. There was no one inside. The room was bare, save for a small wooden chair in the center of the floor, its legs worn down, the wood cracked and old. The walls were bare, the window covered in a thick layer of grime that kept out most of the light. But the room felt alive, as though it had just been used, as though someone or something had just been there. The whispers died down, but the air still felt thick, as though it had been waiting for me to open the door. I shut it quickly, my heart racing. The silence crept back, but now it was even more oppressive, more suffocating. I moved down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath me. The next door on my left beckoned. I could hear the voices growing louder again, swirling behind the door like a faint, haunting melody. I opened it. Empty. This room was different from the first, though it was larger, and on the walls there were strange symbols scribbled hastily, like someone had been marking the walls with chalk or charcoal. The floor was dusty, and there was a sense of decay in the air, as though this room had been untouched for a long time. But again, there was nothing. No one. Just the eerie sense of something that had been there moments ago, but had slipped away. I stepped back, feeling a cold draft slip through the crack between the door and its frame. Something wasn't right here. The voices seemed louder now, more insistent. They seemed to move with me, following me, echoing from the rooms behind closed doors. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling me. I hurried down the hall, not looking back, but the deeper I went, the more the whispers seemed to grow, until they were a constant hum in my ears. Every door I passed seemed to beckon me, and every time I reached one, I could feel the pull, like the door itself wanted me to open it. But the fear was overwhelming now. The air was thick with it, pressing against my chest. The silence outside the rooms growing more profound. I reached the end of the hallway. Another door. This one at the very end. It was different from the others, newer. Its paint unscuffed, its edges pristine. The whispers were louder here, and I could hear them more clearly than ever before. It was as if the voices were right on the other side of the door, their words blending together into a single, cohesive message that I couldn't quite understand. I placed my hand on the handle, but before I could turn it, I heard a sound behind me, the distinct click of a door one of the others opening. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching behind me, the doors closed, the whispers now soft and distant, as though they were moving away from me. I turned back to the door at the end of the hall, my hand still on the handle. My body felt heavy, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked back out the way I came. But something in me, the same pull, the same strange curiosity, kept me there. I turned the handle. The door opened, empty. The room inside was larger than the others, but it was not the room that shocked me. It was the walls. The walls were covered in mirrors. Everywhere I looked, my own reflection stared back at me, fractured and multiplied. But something was wrong. The reflections were moving independently. They were different. Some were smiling, others frowning, their movements slightly delayed, as though they were not quite in sync with my own. Some of them tilted their heads as I stepped inside, their eyes following me in ways that felt too deliberate. And then, One of my reflections spoke. "Why are you still here?" it asked. I froze, my heart stopped. The reflection grinned, a twisted, knowing smile stretching across its face. It wasn't me. Not anymore. It was something else. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. But the whispers, they followed me. The tram stopped mid-track and the stations changed around me. I had been on the tram for what felt like hours, the gentle rattle of its wheels over the tracks a familiar, soothing rhythm. The city outside had started to blur into a pattern of dim streetlights and the occasional figure huddled under an umbrella, waiting to cross. The evening had a certain stillness to it, the kind you don't notice until you're far into it, lost in your own thoughts. I wasn't in a rush, not really. I had decided to take the tram instead of walking that evening. A small choice to change up my routine, to break the monotony of my usual path. It was a gray evening, the kind where the rain seemed to hang in the air, thick with the promise of a storm. The tram wasn't full. A few commuters were scattered throughout, some reading, some staring out of the windows as the city passed by. I had no destination in mind, just the desire to drift with the motion of the tram, to let it carry me wherever it wanted. We passed through several stations, old, familiar stops. I watched as people got off and others boarded, the soft hum of the tram's engine and the murmur of quiet conversations filling the air. I hadn't really been paying attention when the tram came to an abrupt halt. It wasn't a jarring stop, no screeching of brakes or sudden lurch forward. It simply stopped. The lights flickered overhead, and the low hum of the tram quieted, leaving a stillness in its wake. I looked around, wondering if something had gone wrong, but no one seemed particularly bothered. The driver's cabin was dark, and I could see no sign of the usual movement, no head popping out to announce a delay or reason for the stop. It was just the calm, still pause in the middle of the track. People were still sitting, some looking up in mild confusion, others returning to whatever they had been doing. But something felt off. The city outside looked different, somehow darker, more distant, as though we had crossed into another world. I leaned forward, looking through the window. The station sign outside, which had been clearly visible just a moment before, was now blurred, the letters unreadable. The usual graffiti on the walls of the station platform was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. And then, just as I was beginning to doubt my own eyes, the sign changed. I blinked. It didn't make sense. The station name had changed. It was no longer the familiar stop I was used to. The letters on the sign read something I didn't recognize. A name that wasn't even close to the one I had seen moments before. I leaned back in my seat, looking at the other passengers. No one seemed to have noticed. They were all still sitting, quietly, like nothing had happened. The tram hadn't moved, yet the world around me had shifted. I glanced at the next station sign that appeared a few moments later. The tram hadn't budged, but the name of the next station was completely different too. It was as though the tram wasn't on the same tracks anymore. A chill ran through me. I pressed my hand against the cold window, trying to see if the city outside looked the same. But no, it didn't. The streetlights outside were dimmer. The buildings were unfamiliar, older somehow. I could still hear the faint chatter of passengers, but there was a quiet hum in the air, something deep and unsettling. I glanced around the tram again, my heart rate picking up. I had been on this tram before, countless times, but the feeling of déjà vu was stronger than it had ever been. It felt like I was in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The tram began moving again, almost imperceptibly, and I felt the air shift as it slowly picked up speed. The next station arrived with the same quiet ease, but the station name was different again. I stood up, my legs shaky, and approached the doors. The view outside had changed entirely. The buildings were no longer familiar. There were no street signs, no landmarks I recognized. The cityscape outside felt foreign, twisted in ways I couldn't explain. I glanced back at the others, but no one seemed to share my unease. They were all either absorbed in their phones or staring blankly ahead. A few had earbuds in, and one person was softly humming along to a song. I couldn't understand how they could be so calm. The tram passed several more stations, each one more unfamiliar than the last. The names on the signs were more strange and distant, like something I might have read in a dream, but never in reality. And all the while, the city outside became more surreal. The architecture shifting subtly, the streetlights casting longer shadows, the sky growing darker. It was as if the world was folding in on itself, and I was trapped in a loop that I couldn't escape. Finally, I stood up. I had to get off. I couldn't take the disorienting ride any longer. My hands were clammy as I reached for the door, but just as I stepped toward it, the tram slowed down again. I glanced around, the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. No one else was moving, no one else was reacting. Everyone was still sitting, their heads down, their eyes glazed over. The tram stopped. The doors didn't open. I could see the next station up ahead, an old, decrepit building with cracked windows. But the name on the station sign was unfamiliar. It wasn't one I had ever seen before. I waited, but no one moved to get off. No one seemed to care. I stepped toward the doors, my breath shallow, my mind racing, but the doors remained closed. The tram wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't letting me out. Suddenly, a voice came from behind me. "Next stop." "You're almost there," the voice said. It was the driver, but it wasn't the driver I had seen earlier. The voice was strange, distorted, distant. It didn't match the voice I had heard on the intercom earlier in the ride. It felt wrong. I turned to face the front of the tram, but the driver's cabin was empty. There was no one at the controls. The tram began to move again, slowly, almost as though it were gliding through some invisible force. The stations began to change faster now, one after the other, flickering past like shadows in a dream. The city outside became less and less real, as though the tram were no longer part of the city at all. It felt like I was moving through a place that existed only in the edges of my mind, a place where time and space no longer made sense. The tram picked up speed again, the vibrations underneath me growing stronger. I couldn't tell if we were heading anywhere or just circling, stuck in a loop that I couldn't escape from. The city outside was now completely unrecognizable, a blur of shapes and lights, nothing familiar. The names on the stations were unreadable. I pressed my hand against the window again, but I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The tram kept moving, passing through stations that I would never be able to find again, each one fading into the darkness faster than I could process. The voices in my head grew louder, the panic clawing at the edges of my mind, and then, without warning, the tram came to a complete stop. The doors opened slowly, creaking as if reluctant to let me out. I looked at the sign at the station ahead of me, the last station I would ever see. It was empty now, just the dark platform stretching out in front of me. The city outside was silent, frozen, waiting for something. The door was still open. I didn't step off. I couldn't. The tram doors closed behind me, and the city faded into silence. She handed me a key boot. I didn't know which door it opened. It was a night like any other, the kind of evening where the city feels distant, tucked away behind layers of haze and the soft hum of streetlights. I was walking home from a friend's apartment, my mind drifting through the usual mundane thoughts, what I needed to get at the store, whether I should check my email one more time, or if I'd finally remembered to bring my umbrella. The usual hum of the world around me had a strange softness to it, muted by the chill in the air and the fog rolling in from the river. It was late, the streets quieter than normal, and I found myself walking through familiar blocks, my footsteps slow as I let my mind wander. I passed the small bookstore on the corner, a cozy little place I'd never been inside, but always meant to visit. The window was fogged up from the warmth inside, its soft light spilling out onto the sidewalk, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to stay out too long. It was getting late, and I had an early morning ahead. Just as I was about to turn the corner, I saw her. She was standing at the entrance of the bookstore, near the old door with the brass handle, waiting as if she had been expecting me. I didn't recognize her at first, but there was something strangely familiar about her. She was wearing a dark coat, and her hair was tucked beneath a scarf, her features shadowed by the dim light of the street lamp above. She didn't speak right away, but when she saw me looking at her, she stepped forward with a calm, almost serene smile. I hadn't expected the sudden interaction, but there was something in her eyes, something inviting, like I had crossed some invisible threshold that had led me here, to this very moment. I felt an odd pull, a sense of curiosity and uncertainty. My feet seemed to move without me realizing, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of her. "Are you looking for something?" she asked, her voice soft, like it was meant for the quiet of the night. I shook my head, not sure how to respond. "No, I was just walking home." She nodded slowly, her smile still faint but present. She then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in an old weathered piece of cloth. She handed it to me without saying a word. I took it, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric, and when I unwrapped it, I saw a small brass key. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just an old-fashioned key, the kind you'd find on a vintage door or an antique lock. The teeth were worn smooth with time, and the metal had a slight tarnish, but it was solid, real. I turned it over in my hand, the cold weight of it somehow making my chest tighten. "What's this for?" I asked, looking up at her. There was an unsettling stillness to the moment, as if everything around us had slowed down, waiting for an answer. Her smile remained, but her eyes grew a little more distant. "It's for you," she said simply. "It will lead you where you need to go." I looked at the key again, my confusion growing. "Where?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, her gaze briefly shifting to the bookstore behind her. There was a slight breeze in the air, making the street lamp flicker softly, the shadows around us stretching longer. When she looked back at me, her smile was gone, replaced by something unreadable, almost melancholic. "It's not for me to tell you," she said, her voice quiet, like she was saying something just for me to hear. "You'll know when you're ready." I opened my mouth to ask more, to demand some kind of explanation, but before I could, she was already stepping back, blending into the shadows of the bookstore's entrance, as if she had always belonged there. Without another word, she disappeared into the quiet darkness. I stood there for a moment, holding the key in my hand, the faint echo of her words ringing in my ears. "You'll know when you're ready." But ready for what? Where was I supposed to go? The key meant nothing to me. It wasn't like I had any particular door in mind. It was just a key. A strange feeling washed over me. I turned the key over again, running my thumb along the worn edges, and the faintest shiver crawled up my spine. I could still feel the weight of her presence lingering in the air around me. I didn't know what to do, but something about the key felt important. Something told me that I needed to figure it out, that I couldn't just ignore it. So, I slipped it into my pocket and started walking again, feeling the city stretch out before me, the rain starting to fall again, lightly but steadily. As I walked, the key remained in my pocket, a quiet pressure against my side, and I found myself looking for anything that might make sense of it. But the city felt different now, as though the streets I walked had subtly shifted, as if they knew something I didn't. I passed my apartment building, but something inside me told me not to stop there. I kept walking. The streetlights felt dimmer, their glow softer. The shops I usually passed seemed quieter, their windows blurred in the rain. The night stretched on, and with each step, I felt as though I was walking in a place that didn't quite belong to me, as though I had crossed some invisible boundary and found myself on the edge of something I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't until I reached the old iron gate at the end of the block that I felt the pull again. Something about this place seemed familiar. It wasn't much, just a gate, an old brick wall, the kind of place people usually ignore. But tonight, it felt significant. The kind of place where a door might be waiting, though I had no idea why I thought that. I stepped toward the gate, my heart pounding in my chest. The key was still in my pocket, and I suddenly felt like I had to use it. The gate creaked softly as I pushed it open. Behind it, the path was dark, narrow, and overgrown with ivy. It looked like it had been forgotten, hidden behind the newer buildings, its presence unnoticed by most people. But tonight, it seemed to call to me, its quiet invitation beckoning me forward. I hesitated, then pulled the key from my pocket. It felt warm in my hand, as though it had been waiting for this moment. I stepped toward the gate, finding the lock just beneath the ivy, almost hidden. I slid the key into the lock, and it turned with a soft click. The gate opened with a groan, and I stepped through. Beyond, it was a courtyard, old, neglected, but beautiful in its stillness. The air here was different, still, almost stagnant. The night felt deeper in this place, the shadows thick, the silence profound. But there, in the distance, just beyond the courtyard, I saw it, a door. It stood alone, tucked into the stone wall, its wood dark with age. The faintest light seemed to flicker behind it, like a lantern, but it wasn't enough to fully illuminate the space. I stepped forward, the key still clutched tightly in my hand, and approached the door. It was the same kind of key that had been given to Mitha, same one I had carried in my pocket since the bookstore. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision. There was no turning back now. I knew, deep down, that this was the place the key had been meant for. I inserted the key into the lock. The metal turned, and with a creak, the door slowly opened. But what lay beyond? The answer was something I still couldn't understand. Something that I knew would change everything once I stepped through. The key had led me here, and there was no way of knowing where it would take me next. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me. And I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer in the world I had once known. I had unlocked something somewhere unknown, somewhere waiting, but it was no longer mine to understand. Not yet. I saw a reflection of myself, but it was moving independently. It happened one evening, when the sky was a darkened slate of clouds, heavy with the promise of rain that had already begun to fall. I had been walking home after a long, tiring day at work. My footsteps echoed softly on the wet pavement, and the rhythmic sound of the rain tapping against the umbrella in my hand was the only real company I had. The city was quieter than usual. The streets were empty, save for a few scattered pedestrians, and the occasional car passing by, its headlights glistening in the slick streets. As I neared the corner near my apartment, I passed an old, weathered store with large glass windows. The sign above it had long since faded, but I'd always noticed it when walking this route. It was one of those forgotten places that felt like it belonged to a time before, tucked away in the corner of the city, still clinging to its place, but not really a part of it anymore. I had never stopped to look inside, but tonight I did. Something about the reflection caught my attention. As I passed by, my eyes naturally drifted to the glass, expecting to see the familiar image of myself, drenched in rain, tired but content, holding my umbrella. But that's not what I saw. The moment I glanced into the window, my reflection appeared, as it always had, just me, walking along the street. But then something shifted. My reflection didn't just mirror me. It moved on its own. At first, I thought it was some trick of the light, or a sudden dizziness making me see things. But when I looked again, I saw it more clearly. I was standing still, my eyes locked with my reflection in the glass. But my reflection wasn't standing still. It was walking in the opposite direction. As I stood frozen there, staring, it was as though my reflection was striding confidently away from me, moving against my own body's will. My reflection's posture was subtly different, to where I felt worn. My shoulders slouched with exhaustion. The figure in the glass was upright, standing straighter, moving with purpose. It was me, but it wasn't. I took a step back, shaking my head as if to clear away a fog. And my reflection did the same, but it didn't stop walking. It was walking away from me. Its movements were fluid, sure, as if it was following its own path, its own direction. I could see the details in the window more clearly now. I could see my reflection's face. My face, but there was a subtle, unsettling change in its expression. My reflection was smiling, but it was a smile I didn't recognize. It was too wide, too knowing, like it had some secret it wasn't sharing with me. I couldn't breathe. My body went rigid. The reflection kept moving in till it stopped, turned, and looked at me. I felt my chest tighten. My reflection's eyes met mine, but they weren't mine anymore. They were darker, emptier, like someone else had taken control. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised its hand and pointed at me, just as I had been pointing at it. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The reflection smiled again, the corners of its mouth twitching as if it was savoring the fear it had just evoked. It felt as though it was teasing me, enjoying my confusion, playing with me in a way that I couldn't understand. Then, with another motion that was far too deliberate, it turned and walked away, further into the glass, until it was lost in the shadowy depth of the reflection. I stood there, breathless, my mind spinning as I tried to process what had just happened. The street around me felt distant now, as if I had crossed some invisible boundary, and I was no longer a part of it. I was still standing there, watching the glass, waiting for the reflection to return, but it was gone. I stepped back again, slowly this time, my hands trembling slightly as I lowered my umbrella. I didn't want to turn away, but I had to. Something in me screamed to leave, to walk away from the window, from the reflection, from the thing that had just moved without me. But as I walked away, I couldn't stop glancing back. The glass was still there, the store still quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I continued on my way, but every step felt heavier than the last. The rain, which had been gently falling before, now seemed louder, as if the world was pressing in around me, surrounding me with a sound that kept me grounded. Yet, in my mind, I could still see it, my reflection, walking away from me, moving without me, its smile lingering in my mind, growing wider with every step. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that the rain on the window had created an optical illusion, something to explain the way my reflection seemed to move. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The way it had turned, smiled, and pointed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my reflection again, walking away from me, disappearing into the dark glass of the window. I didn't go near that street for days. But even now, when I walk through the city, I can't help but wonder if my reflection is still out there somewhere, walking away from me, living a life I never knew, as I stand frozen, watching it from the corner of the world. And every time I pass a window, I feel a flicker of hesitation, a nervous glance to the glass, wondering if it will move again. The sidewalk split in two and both led me somewhere unknown. It had been a long day, one of those where the city seems to close in around you, its noises muffled by the weight of exhaustion. The sky was a dull gray, The rain from earlier that afternoon, now only a lingering mist in the air, giving everything a soft, washed-out look. I was walking home, my mind a blur of unimportant thoughts, what to eat for dinner. The emails I still hadn't answered, the events of the day that had already started to fade from memory. The street was quiet, mostly empty. The usual hustle and bustle of the city had given way to the late-hour calm, broken only by the occasional car passing by or a distant voice echoing off the buildings. I was on a street I had walked down 1,000 times, the same cracked sidewalk, the same streetlights flickering above. But tonight, something felt different. I didn't notice it at first, not until I was almost halfway down the block. The sidewalk ahead of me suddenly seemed to shift. It was as though the concrete had grown restless, a subtle tremor underfoot that I couldn't explain. I glanced down, expecting to see something cracks, loose stones. The typical wear and tear of an old street, but there was nothing. Just the same familiar path. Except, as I looked ahead, I saw it. The sidewalk split. It wasn't a clean break, not in the way you'd expect from something that had been damaged over time. No, this was deliberate. The pavement had split in two, the line running straight down the middle, creating two distinct paths. It wasn't a gap, not exactly just a visible division. As if the sidewalk had been sliced in half, the two halves now leaning slightly away from each other, separated by a crack that seemed to shimmer, as though it was alive, pulsing with something I couldn't quite understand. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. I had walked this street 100 times, and I had never seen this before. The sidewalk had always been the same, solid and unchanging, leading me home, never asking questions. But now, it was different. I stood there, frozen, for longer than I should have. I had to make a choice. On the left, the sidewalk continued, its path familiar, but the crack running through it had deepened, almost as if it were calling me forward, daring me to step into it. On the right, the sidewalk also continued, but there was something darker about that side. The path was slightly obscured by shadows, the light from the street lamp above dimming as if it couldn't quite reach that part of the sidewalk. It seemed colder there, as if the air was thicker. I looked down at the split again, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign to indicate which way to go, no arrow, no clue. It was just a choice. Two paths, both leading somewhere unknown, and neither one more familiar than the other. Something pulled me toward the left side, but only for a moment. My feet shuffled, hesitant, as I looked at the darkened path on the right. I should have felt more afraid, more cautious, but instead, I felt drawn. I don't know why. It was as though the right side had called to me, softly, whispering in the quiet of the night. It was a subtle feeling, one I couldn't explain, but it was enough to push me to take the first step. As my foot touched the right side of the crack, I felt a strange shiver, like the ground had shifted beneath me, just slightly. The air seemed to change, turning cooler, heavier, as though I had crossed some invisible threshold. I paused, looking back down the street. But the familiar buildings, the lamplights, everything looked wrong. The world around me seemed to blur for just a second. The edges of the street stretching out like a painting left too dry too long. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I was just tired, but the feeling in my chest had deepened. The streetlights flickered as I moved forward, their soft glow casting long, exaggerated shadows that reached toward me. The crack in the sidewalk seemed to grow wider the farther I walked, as if it were opening, expanding, drawing me in. My breath quickened, my footsteps growing louder in my ears. I wanted to turn back, but something held me there, something pulling me forward, as though I had no choice but to keep going. And then, just as I thought I might turn around, something shifted in the distance. A figure stood at the far end of the sidewalk. They were too far away for me to make out details at first, but the way they stood, their silhouette outlined by the dim light, was unmistakable. They were looking directly at me, standing still, as if they had been waiting for me. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their gaze, and that feeling made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the shadows, watching. I stopped, my heart thudding in my chest. The air had grown still, almost unbearably quiet. The sound of my own breath, my heartbeat, seemed louder than the rest of the world combined. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but there was something unsettling in the way they waited. I wanted to call out to them, ask if they were lost, if they needed help, but my voice caught in my throat. I continued walking, but the closer I got, the more I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The figure remained just at the edge of my vision, standing still, waiting until I was only a few feet away from them. The shadows surrounding them seemed to grow, pulling tighter, enclosing them in darkness. And then, just as I reached out to speak, they stepped back. Slowly, deliberately, they retreated into the shadows, their form melting into the darkness of the sidewalk. I stood there, frozen, watching where they had been, but there was nothing left. No sign of them, no trace. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and looked ahead. The sidewalk ahead of me had changed. The crack in the pavement had widened, and the path seemed to stretch endlessly, its end now a distant blur. The streetlights flickered again, and the world around me felt different. The familiar, mundane world I had known had slipped away, replaced by something strange, something that didn't belong. I turned back, intending to return to the split, to take the other path, but as I looked behind me, I realized it was gone. The left side of the sidewalk, the one I had almost chosen, had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. All that remained was the long, winding path ahead of me, stretching farther than I could see. I couldn't turn back anymore. I had no choice but to keep moving forward. The street, the city, the world, they were no longer the same. The sidewalk had split, and now, no matter which way I went, it was leading me somewhere I couldn't understand, somewhere I couldn't escape. And I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the path was only just beginning. The city ahead of me was not the one I had known. It was something else, something unknowable, something that didn't follow the rules. And the further I walked, the more I understood there was no escape. No going back. The sidewalk had split, and both paths led somewhere I wasn't ready to go. She walked into the alley, but it stretched longer than possible. I had been watching her from across the street, my feet slowing as I walked past the row of dimly lit shops. The evening had settled into that quiet calm that only happens after a rainstorm, where the city feels like it's holding its breath. The air smelled of wet pavement and distant earth, and I felt the cold from the sidewalks seep through my shoes. The street was empty except for her figure, almost hidden beneath the awning of an old cafe. Her silhouette outlined by the faint streetlights flickering overhead. She looked ordinary infowoman in a long coat, hair tucked beneath a scarf. Her steps slow and deliberate as she approached the alleyway between two old buildings. I hadn't meant to stare, but something about the way she moved caught my attention. It was as though she was unaware of everything around her, lost in thought or in some kind of reverie. Her eyes were cast downward, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if carrying some unseen weight. I kept walking, my mind on other things, but my feet instinctively veered toward the alley, as if drawn by an invisible thread. I had walked down this street 100 times, and the alley had always been there, narrow and unremarkable, disappearing between two worn brick buildings. But tonight, as I walked closer, there was something different. The shadows at the entrance seemed deeper than usual, and the faint echo of distant footsteps inside the alley made the hairs on my neck rise. As I passed the entrance, I turned my head toward it. That's when I saw her again. She had already stepped into the alley, her back to me, moving slowly, almost as if she was unsure whether to go forward. I paused, watching her, feeling an odd sense of unease. The alley was darker than it had any right to be at this hour, and, as she disappeared deeper into it, I noticed something strange. The shadows seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, as though the alley was growing longer with each step she took. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A man walking behind me paused too, his eyes following her into the alley. But he didn't seem to know what to make of it either. He muttered something under his breath, then quickly walked past, his footsteps quickening. Something about the alley felt wrong. The way it bent, the way it swallowed, light, it felt alive, in a way I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just the darkness, but the way it seemed to pull at the edges of my perception, as though the walls of the alley were creeping inward, closing in with every passing moment. I hesitated. Should I follow her? I didn't know why I felt this compulsion, but it was strong enough to keep me rooted to the spot. The rain had started up again, tapping softly on the pavement, and the distant hum of the city felt muffled. I glanced down at my watch, though I didn't need to. The feeling in my chest told me that time had already shifted, had already bent in some way I couldn't grasp. I took a deep breath and, without thinking, I followed. The air in the alley felt colder, heavier, as I passed beneath the brick archway. I glanced to my left and right as I walked, noticing how the narrow walls pressed close together, their surfaces damp with condensation. There was no sound here, no distant laughter from the street or hum of cars passing by. It was as though the alley existed in its own world, one that had been cut off from the rest of the city. The further I walked, the more I felt a sense of isolation, a tightness in my chest that grew with each step. And yet, ahead of me, she was still walking, moving, with that same slow, steady pace. The alley was long, far longer than I had remembered. The buildings seemed to stretch farther than before, the space between them growing wider, though there was still no way for the alley to extend this far. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the familiar street, but it was gone. The entrance to the alley had vanished, swallowed up by the dark walls, as though the street had never existed. I turned back to the woman, now a little farther ahead, her figure more distant but still moving forward. I tried to call out to her, to ask if she had noticed, if she knew what was happening, but my voice wouldn't rise above a whisper. My heart was pounding now, faster than I realized, as I picked up my pace to catch up. With each step, the alley seemed to stretch even further, the walls receding just enough to keep the distance between us growing. I couldn't see the end anymore. The alley had no end, no clear boundary. It was endless, a shifting, twisting corridor that refused to let go. I kept my eyes on the woman ahead, but as I drew closer, something changed in the way she moved. She wasn't walking anymore. She was gliding, almost as if she were floating inches above the ground. There was no sound to her steps, no weight to her movements, and she never turned around. I stopped. I was close now, so close that I could have reached out and touched her shoulder, but I couldn't move any closer. The air had grown thick, and the darkness seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. I looked ahead again, and in that instant, the woman vanished into the shadows. I was standing alone in the middle of the alley, the quiet, oppressive. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what I had just seen, but nothing made sense. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing. No signs of life, no escape. The alley stretched endlessly in both directions, like a maze with no way out. I turned back to where I had come from, desperate to find the street, desperate to escape the strange empty space I was trapped in. But the more I looked, the more I realized that I couldn't remember where I had entered. The way out had become a blur, the entrance to the alley a distant memory, like something I had imagined. I began walking again, this time faster, as if the alley might collapse behind me if I didn't move quickly enough. But the more I walked, the longer it became. The buildings seemed to distort, the alley narrowing, then widening again, stretching farther than I could comprehend. I glanced over my shoulder once more, but this time I didn't see her. The woman was gone, and the alley had become a place that no longer followed the rules of the city, a place that didn't lead anywhere, but simply stretched. Eventually, I stopped trying to find my way out. I stood there, staring at the endless path ahead, and for the first time, I realized I had always been walking in circles. The alley had no end. There was no way back. The woman was gone, but I could still hear her soft, steady footsteps, growing closer again, like they were always just behind me, following me down this endless, stretching path. I took a step forward, unsure of what would happen next, but feeling, deep inside, that I would never leave the alley. Not truly. Not unless I learned to stop walking. But I couldn't stop. I found a door between two buildings, but it opened into another city. It was late in the evening, the air thick with the dampness of a long rain that had just stopped. The streets, washed clean by the downpour, shimmered under the soft light of I had been walking for hours, losing track of time as I wandered through the quieter parts of the city, letting my thoughts drift aimlessly like the mist rising from the ground. My mind was caught between work and home, between worries and the need to just escape. The neighborhood I was in wasn't one I frequented. It was tucked away, a maze of narrow streets and alleyways I'd never explored. The buildings here were older, worn, their faded facades telling stories of years gone by, stories that had been forgotten by most people. I wasn't sure why I had turned down this particular street, but something about it felt oddly inviting. The stillness of the rain-soaked pavement, the quiet hum of distant traffic, it all felt peaceful. I could almost hear the rhythm of my footsteps echoing softly in the emptiness. As I walked, I noticed a gap between two old buildings ahead. It wasn't much, just a narrow alleyway between the brick walls, the kind of space that usually gets ignored or passed by. But something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the way the space seemed to draw me in, or how the faint light from the street lamps bounced off the wet ground, creating soft pools of light that seemed to beckon me closer. I stepped closer to the gap, peering into the darkness beyond. At first, I thought it was just a dead-end alley, a forgotten place. But as I took another step, I saw it, a door. Not a big door, but a simple wooden one, half hidden between the two buildings, its frame weathered but intact. It was strange. There was something about it that didn't quite fit. The door looked old, but it was somehow more polished than the rest of the alley. The wood seemed too smooth, too cared for, considering the state of the buildings around it. I couldn't recall ever seeing this door before, but somehow it felt familiar, like I had walked past it 1,000 times, even though I knew I hadn't. Curiosity nudged me forward. There was something about the door, something that made me want to see what lay beyond it. I reached out and gripped the handle, which was oddly warm against my cold fingers. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the city behind me. But the quiet was so complete, so different from what I had grown used to. There was no sound here, no traffic, no people. Only the sound of the rainwater dripping off the gutters above. I turned the handle. The door creaked open with a low groan, and I stepped inside. At first, I thought the alley behind me would still be there, its narrow walls just beyond the door. But the instant I crossed the threshold, I felt something shift. The air was different, fresher, but with a strange weight to it, as if the world itself had suddenly changed. I glanced back at the door, but the alley was gone. There was no brick wall, no Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of a street I didn't recognize, under a sky that was darker, thicker, than the one I had left behind. The city around me was unfamiliar tall, imposing buildings stretched high above, their glass windows reflecting the faint glow of distant lights. The streets were wide, lined with trees whose branches swayed gently, despite the fact that there was no wind. The pavement was smooth and clean, but everything about this city felt wrong. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The sound of distant voices echoed through the streets, but they weren't the usual city sounds I had grown used to. These voices were muffled, as though coming from behind a thick wall. The air smelled different, too, not like rain, but like something older, something that reminded me of dusty libraries and forgotten places. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no sign of anyone nearby, but the feeling of being watched lingered at the edge of my awareness. an uncomfortable pressure in the pit of my stomach. I looked around at the buildings, their facades strange and unfamiliar, and I felt an odd sense of nostalgia, like I had been here before, though I knew I hadn't. The street stretched ahead, leading to an intersection where a soft light flickered, casting long shadows against the pavement. I walked toward the light, my steps slow, deliberate, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding around me. As I approached the intersection, I noticed the street signs widely shaped, written in a language I didn't recognize. The letters curved and twisted in strange patterns, completely foreign to anything I knew. A quiet whisper of wind passed by, carrying with it the faintest scent of something unfamiliar. It made my skin prickle. I stepped into the intersection, the rain-soaked ground beneath my feet now feeling strangely solid, as if the city itself was holding me in place. And then, just as I reached the middle of the street, something shifted in the distance. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow, moving at the far end, but as it came closer, I could make out the shape of a person, walking toward me with a slow, purposeful pace. They were dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by the hood of their jacket. They moved with a calm, measured stride, as if they knew exactly where they were going. I watched them approach, unable to look away. As they neared, they stopped and turned, their gaze locking onto mine. I couldn't see their face, only the shadowed outline of their hood, but the sense of recognition I felt was unsettling. My heart skipped a beat, the sudden, inexplicable certainty that I knew this person growing stronger. But before I could react, the figure turned and walked away, fading into the shadows of the street as if they had never been there. I stood motionless for a moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was something about this city, about this place that was all wrong. Nothing felt right. The more I looked around, the more it felt like I was stuck in some strange version of my own world, where everything was just a little off. I took a step back, intending to leave, but when I turned to look for the door, I couldn't find it. The street I had entered from the alley between the two buildings was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. In its place was just the endless stretch of unfamiliar streets, each one more bizarre than the last. The door that had brought me here, the path I thought would lead me back, it was gone. I walked deeper into the city, not knowing where I was headed or how to escape. The feeling of déjà vu, of something deeply familiar and yet alien, wrapped around me like a shroud. And no matter how far I walked, no matter how many streets I turned down, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being guided somewhere, to some unknown destination that had already been decided for me. The door had opened into another city. But now, I wasn't sure if it was a place I had found or if it had found me. The streetlight cast shadows that didn't belong. It was a quiet evening, the kind of night that wraps the city in a muted, gray fog. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the pavement still glistened, reflecting the dull glow of the streetlights. I was walking home, tired from a long day, the familiar path underfoot like a worn-out thread I knew all too well. My boots splashed lightly in the puddles, and the cool air seemed to settle into my bones as I walked, making the night feel heavy, somehow. But there was something else too, a feeling that crept into my mind as I passed the corner of Pine Street. I couldn't place it at first. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a strange unease that shifted in my chest. The street was empty, just like it always was at this time of night. The houses on the left side of the road stood in their neat rows, their windows dark. On the right, the alleyway stretched into shadows, its entrance marked by a single flickering streetlight that seemed to buzz with a strange intensity. I turned onto Pine Street, my eyes naturally drawn to the light ahead. The soft orange glow was comforting, as streetlights usually are, but tonight it felt wrong. The light didn't reach as far as it should have, and the shadows it cast seemed too long, as though the darkness around it was eager to spread beyond its reach. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The shadows beneath the light, they didn't make sense. They weren't just stretched and distorted by the flickering light. They were moving. No, not moving. Exactly, shifting was a better word. They slithered and writhed along the pavement, shifting in ways that didn't match the angle of the light. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows stretched unnaturally, as though they were alive, pulling at the ground, tugging at the edges of the pavement, their dark shapes curling in directions that defied reason. I stood there for a long moment, watching them, a slow dread creeping through my chest. It was a ridiculous thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. These shadows live in some strange way. Curling toward me with an almost intentional movement, felt aware, like they had a purpose, a reason for their existence beyond simple darkness. I took a step back, but the shadows didn't stop. They shifted even more violently now, as though trying to break free from their restraint beneath the light. I wanted to turn around and run, to escape the feeling that had settled over me like a thick fog, but I couldn't move. My body was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the strange, living darkness before me. The shadows on the ground were no longer just dark shapes. They had begun to take form, faint outlines, like hands stretching from the pavement, thin fingers that seemed to reach toward me. I blinked, thinking I was imagining it, but when I opened my eyes again, they were still there, larger now, creeping closer, their movement too deliberate to be just an effect of the light. The shadows, they had shape. Not human shape exactly, but something close. Something wrong. In a panic, I turned and started walking faster, my pace quickening as I hurried to pass under the light. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were following me, sliding along the pavement just behind me, tugging at the corners of my vision, growing longer with every step I took. The sound of my boots splashing in the puddles became louder, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder just once and saw them there, stretching, reaching for me as if they wanted to pull me back into their embrace. I could swear I heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice calling from just out of reach. I quickened my pace, walking as fast as I could, but the further I went, the more the shadows seemed to stretch out from beneath the streetlight, as though the light itself was drawing them forward. I didn't want to look back again, but the pull of those shapes behind me was overwhelming, like a tug at the back of my mind. It felt like the shadows weren't just shadows anymore, they were something more. I reached the end of the block, and the shadows began to recede, pulling back under the light, their movements growing sluggish and erratic, as if they were losing their strength. finally forced back into their corners by the glow of the light. I stopped for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to gather myself. My chest was tight, my hands shaking slightly as I glanced back. The street was quiet now. The light flickered softly, casting its usual steady orange glow onto the pavement. But the shadows had vanished, slipping back into the darkness with only the faintest lingering traces of their movement. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the whole thing, if it had all been some trick of the mind, the rain, the weird angle of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I had just witnessed something unnatural. I continued on, my steps quickening again, moving out from under the streetlight's reach. But even as I passed out of its glow and into the deeper shadow of the street, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't entirely alone. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, clung to me, tight as a shadow itself. When I finally reached the safety of my apartment building, I paused at the entrance, my hand on the door handle. I took one last look down the street. The streetlight was still there, standing tall, flickering softly in the night. And beneath it, the shadows, though no longer moving, seemed to linger, stretching out in ways that they shouldn't. I don't know why I didn't go back out. Maybe it was the weight of the moment, the way my mind was fraying at the edges, but I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. But every time I close my eyes, I see them, those shadows, twisting and stretching, waiting beneath the light. And I know they'll be there again whenever I step back outside, because they don't belong to the dark. They belong to the light, and I'm not sure they'll ever let me forget that. She whispered behind me, but there was no one there. It happened on one of those nights where the rain had been falling for so long it felt like part of the air itself. The streets were slick and shining, each streetlight haloed in mist, casting long, faint reflections on the wet ground. I had been walking home later than usual, my hood pulled up, the steady patter of rain masking every other sound. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence, as though the world itself had grown tired. The road I was on was familiar, my usual route. It ran straight for 3 blocks before turning toward my building. I liked this stretch of the walk because of how empty it always felt at night. The old trees arched over the sidewalk, and the narrow buildings with their shuttered windows seemed to lean inward, forming a dim tunnel of brick and dripping leaves. I had always felt safe there, predictable, but that night, the quiet wasn't soothing. It was too complete, too deep, like a soundless weight pressing in from all sides. My boots splashed softly against the puddles, and I found myself listening more closely than usual. My own footsteps echoed faintly against the walls, but there was nothing else. No passing cars, no distant voices, no life. Halfway down the block, I slowed. I don't know why. Some part of me sensed something, the way animals do before a storm. The rain softened for a moment, a lull between drizzles, and that's when I heard Ita whisper. Soft, low, right behind me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was unmistakably human, faint but clear, a hiss of breath so close I could almost feel it brush the back of my neck. I spun around instantly, my heart hammering, but the street was empty. The puddles glistened under the lamps. The trees dripped steadily. There was no one there. No shadow moving, no figure retreating into the darkness. Just the rain resuming its steady patter, like nothing had happened. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the wind had funneled through the buildings. Maybe water, dripping from a gutter, had mimicked a voice. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. There had been shape to that sound, a rhythm, a deliberate softness, like someone leaning close to speak. I started walking again, faster now, my shoulders hunched, my ears straining. The alley stretched ahead, looking longer than I remembered. I tried to focus on my steps, the sound of rain, the familiar rhythm of the city, but the whisper lingered in my memory, curling around my thoughts like a thread. And then I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. Still soft, still low, but unmistakably voice, right behind me. Lips almost at my ear, though the words were too faint to understand. My heart jumped. I spun again, almost slipping on the wet pavement. But the street was as empty as before. I stared at the puddles, at the flickering glow of the street lamps, at the dripping leaves above. Nothing moved. No door opened. No window shut. The silence after the whisper was absolute, thick as a held breath. I began walking faster, my body moving on instinct now, driven by something deeper than reason. My apartment wasn't far. I just had to make it back. Each step echoed like a pulse against the buildings. And every few steps I could swear I heard a second set of footsteps behind me, perfectly in time with my own. Whenever I stopped, they stopped too. When I reached the corner of my street, I dared a glance over my shoulder one last time. The road behind me stretched long and empty, slick with rain. No one followed. But for a split second, just a blink, I thought I saw a shadow standing in the distance. Something tall and still in the haze of the mist. When I blinked again, it was gone. I hurried into my building, shutting the door behind me, leaning against it with my breath coming fast. The whisper had stopped, but the sound of it remained in my head, soft and insistent, as if it had left a mark in the air itself. Even now, sitting here writing this, the memory hasn't faded. The whisper wasn't random. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It felt intentional, as though someone or something was trying to get close enough to speak. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think I still hear it. Right behind me. Just faint enough to doubt, but clear enough to know it's real. And the worst part? Each time I turn around, the room is empty. But I swear, the air where I was just standing feels warm, like someone has been there, whispering only a breath away. I took the shortcut, but ended up where I started. It had been raining lightly for hours, the kind of drizzle that makes the city feel heavier, slower, as if the weight of the water pressing down from the sky seeps into the pavement and into your bones. I had left work later than usual, the streets slick under the dim glow of streetlights, their reflections wavering in the shallow puddles. I was tired, drained, and eager to reach the warmth of my apartment. The usual path home was longer than I liked, and I had noticed a narrow alley on the map earlier that promised a faster route. It wasn't a street I had taken before, but it looked straightforward. A shortcut, I told myself. What could go wrong? I turned into the alley, my boots splashing softly on the wet stones, the sound oddly muffled by the dense night air. The alley was narrower than I expected, walls closing in on either side, a damp brick glinting under the intermittent light of a flickering lamp overhead. The drizzle had turned to a steady rain now, tapping softly against my hood, blending with the quiet sounds of the city. It smelled of wet concrete and old wood, and there was a faint, almost metallic temps to the air. It was quiet, too quiet now. Distant hum of traffic, no footsteps echoing off walls. Only the faint hiss of rain and the soft squelch of my boots on the stone. At first, the alley seemed ordinary enough. I kept my pace steady, telling myself I was simply tired and imagining the silence. But the longer I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The alley stretched longer than I remembered from the map, and with every step, it seemed to twist slightly, turning corners that shouldn't have been there. Shadows pooled in the bends, deep and dark, swallowing the light. My pulse quickened, though I didn't know why. A whisper of wind, or perhaps my imagination, moved across the walls, brushing my ear as if someone or something was following at a distance. I paused at the first fork in the alley, expecting the map's guidance to help, but neither path looked familiar. Both were narrow, wet, and lined with the same mossy, crumbling brick. The sound of my boots seemed amplified now, echoing down the passages in a slow, uneven rhythm. I chose the left path, hoping it would lead me forward, but the feeling of being watched had settled into my chest like a stone. I felt a presence, faint, just beyond sight, never close enough to be seen but constant. I kept moving, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was simply spooked by the darkness. The alley continued, stretching and bending, corners emerging that I had no memory of seeing on the map. Occasionally, I passed old doors set into the brick walls, some half open, some closed tight, all appearing abandoned and unused. I tried to peer inside, expecting nothing, yet each interior looked just slightly wrong. The rooms seemed too deep, the darkness too thick, the silence too complete. I couldn't hear any dripping water or the hum of electricity inside. It was like a pocket of the world that had been sealed off. I felt drawn to them, though I didn't know why, and each time I approached, a shiver ran down my spine, urging me to turn away. At one point, the alley widened into what I thought might be a courtyard. Small and enclosed, the rain pooling in puddles across uneven cobblestones. I paused to catch my breath, glancing around for a landmark, something to assure me I was moving in the right direction. But the more I looked, the less familiar it became. There was no exit I could see, no pathway leading onward, only walls rising high around me, the top lost in shadow and mist. The feeling of being trapped settled deeper now, pressing against my chest. My heartbeat echoed in my ears as if it were the only sound in the world. I decided to backtrack, hoping to retrace my steps. But as I turned, the alley shifted door. Perhaps I had misremembered it. The corners didn't match the path I had taken. The walls seemed longer, narrower, almost closing in. I followed the twists, retracing each step, but every turn seemed to lead me to another similar stretch, another fork, another narrow corridor. The rain continued to fall steadily, its gentle rhythm now mocking me, the wet stones reflecting distorted shadows as though the alley were stretching endlessly. Time became difficult to measure. I couldn't tell how long I had been walking. Each step seemed slower than the last, yet I felt myself moving forward. There were moments when I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, matching my own, yet whenever I turned, the alley remained empty. Sometimes I thought I saw movement at the edge of my Vishnu shadow, passing just beyond a wall. A flicker of light where none should exist, but it was gone. When I looked directly, the silence pressed around me like water, heavy and inescapable. At one point, I stopped completely, leaning against the cold brick to steady myself. I was exhausted, shivering from both the chill of the rain and the rising panic. I glanced up and realized I was staring at a door I had passed before, a small wooden door with peeling paint and rusted hinges. I had seen it earlier in the alley, or at least I was certain I had, but now it looked different, slightly larger, the wood darker, the paint even more flaked. The alley beyond it seemed to stretch, impossibly long, into darkness. I turned to continue, and my stomach dropped. The path I had been following, the way I thought led forward, curved back in a manner I did not remember. The walls seemed to bend unnaturally, folding in on themselves. I walked carefully, stepping slower, each footfall echoing in the confined space. And then, with a growing sense of dread, I recognized a corner, a puddle, the flickering light of the lamp above. My heart sank. I had seen this exact spot before. I walked a few more steps, each one heavier than the last, and froze again. A familiar building came into view, its doorway worn, and the sign above faded. My apartment building, the same corner I had turned to leave the shortcut, the same familiar street I had started from hours ago. I stumbled back, my breath coming fast, my chest tight. I had taken a shortcut to save time, to reach home faster. Yet here I was, standing exactly where I had begun, no faster than before, but exhausted, soaked, and terrified. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, and I realized I hadn't heard a single sound from the street since entering the alley. No cars, no distant voices, no other footsteps. It was as if the world had paused while I wandered. I glanced around, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I had simply become disoriented, a trick of the dark and rain. But something inside me whispered otherwise. The air felt thicker now, heavier, with expectation, as if the alley had been waiting for me to reach the end door perhaps, for me to realize that there was no end. I could feel a subtle shift, the faint brush of wind against my cheek, almost like a presence observing from just beyond my perception. I walked cautiously toward the shortcut again, curious despite the fear, hoping to understand how I had returned to the same place. But the alley appeared the same, yet different corners slightly sharper, shadows darker, the puddles reflecting distorted light in impossible angles. The world seemed to stretch and bend around me, reshaping itself just enough to keep me disoriented, unsure. I paused once more, realizing that no matter which path I took, which turn I made, I always ended up at the same corner, the same puddle, the same flickering lamp, the same doorway of my apartment building. I could feel my sanity fraying, the calm rhythm of my breathing breaking into shallow gasps. The rain kept falling, relentless, and the city around me seemed unaware of the strange cycle I had entered, moving along in its oblivious normality. I finally stepped into the light of my apartment doorway, trembling, drenched, my mind unable to process what had occurred. The hallway was quiet, the familiar sense of home grounding me, but the memory of the alley, the shifting walls, the impossibly stretching passages haunted every nerve. I glanced back over my shoulder toward the street, and for a fraction of a second, I could swear I saw the alley's shadowy mouth opening, waiting, twisting just beyond perception, as if it were patient and alive. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, the image lingers, the alley stretching endlessly, the shadows twisting, the silent whispers brushing against the edge of hearing. I took the shortcut, thinking I would save time, thinking I would find an easier path home. But the alley had no intention of letting me leave. It only leads back to the start, to the place where I began, where the world is the same yet wrong, and the rain never stops falling, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I think I can hear it, the faint squelch of footsteps following behind me, echoing in rhythm with my own, guiding me slowly, inevitably, back to where I started. The rain fell only on me, but the sky was clear. It was a strange feeling, one that caught me off guard the moment I stepped outside. The air was crisp, cool, but not too cold, the kind of weather that makes you feel awake and alive. The sun was high, bright and clear in the blue sky, casting long shadows on the pavement. I was walking to the cafe down the block, a simple, everyday errand to grab a coffee before heading into the office. The streets were busy, as usual, with people walking, chatting, or simply lost in their own worlds, the normal hum of the city surrounding me. I had just begun to enjoy the quiet of the morning when I felt it just a drop, at first. I paused, looking up instinctively, but the sky above was clear, unmarred by a single cloud. The sun blazed, its light sharp, and the air felt dry. I shook my head, trying to brush off the strange feeling, and continued walking. But another drop landed on my cheek, cold and sudden. Then a few more, landing softly on my hair and shoulders. I paused again, my hand instinctively reaching up to wipe the droplets from my face. Still, the sky was clear, the sun shining down as if there wasn't a single cloud in sight. I took another step, and this time the rain felt heavier. It wasn't like the gentle mist you get when the clouds are just on the verge of breaking. No, this was actual rain, large and cold, and it was only falling on me. It wasn't like a downpour that would wet the entire street, nor was it something that might have splashed from a passing car. No, the rain was completely localized, as though the sky above me had decided to release its droplets only in a small circle around me. The strange thing was, no one else seemed to notice. People walked by me as if nothing was happening. The man in front of me continued his conversation on the phone. The woman nearby barely acknowledged the fact that my clothes were beginning to get wet. They all seemed oblivious to the rain that fell only on me, like it wasn't there at all. My footsteps grew heavier as I walked, the droplets increasing in intensity, but still they stayed confined to my body. I could feel the rain on my skin, the chill sinking through my jacket, but the ground beneath my feet stayed dry. There were no puddles around me. The street was as dry as it had been before, the sidewalk untouched, except for where my feet left wet imprints behind me. I reached the cafe, the door chiming as I stepped inside, and the rain stopped immediately. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and looking out the window. The sky outside was still clear, the sun still shining, the air dry. I looked at my clothes, damp from the sudden rainfall, but there was nothing else. No trace of the rain anywhere around me, no sign that anything had happened at all. I ordered my coffee, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the rain that had fallen only on me. As I sipped the coffee, I noticed the way people continued on with their lives, oblivious to the strangeness of the world outside. They moved past me, some exchanging pleasantries, some lost in their own thoughts, none of them acknowledging the oddity I had just experienced. I should have felt better, right? I had my coffee in hand, I was dry now, and the world outside seemed perfectly normal. But the feeling, that oddness in the air, stuck with me. I finished my coffee quickly, too quickly, and stood to leave. I tried to shake off the lingering discomfort as I stepped back outside, but I couldn't. The world felt too still, too perfect. It was as if the moment had been preserved in time, like something was holding it in place, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stepped back onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, the world felt wrong. My steps faltered as I looked around. The street was still dry, no rain. The sky above was still as clear as ever. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A single drop of rain. It landed on the back of my neck. I froze. For a second, my heart skipped a beat, but when I looked around, there was nothing. The rain was gone. The sky still clear. The people still oblivious. The city was unchanged. Only I felt the weight of the moment pressing in. I walked faster now, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to dismiss it, but the unease followed me. Every step felt heavier, like I was carrying the weight of something I couldn't explain, the feeling of being watched, of being outside the ordinary, caught in a moment that no one else could see. I kept walking, trying to ignore the nagging thought in my head. But the longer I walked, the more I felt it, the sense that something was off. The world wasn't right. The rain had fallen, and it hadn't been a mistake. There was something to it, something in the air, something that I couldn't name, but couldn't forget. And even though the day seemed to go on like any other, with people chatting and walking, with the sun shining down on the streets, as if nothing had changed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. As I passed the same street corner, the one I had walked just hours before, I glanced up at the sky, clear, perfect. But I swore I saw a single raindrop fall just above me, and when I looked around, no one else seemed to notice.